While the filming of the Poltergeist trilogy was clearly plagued by several tragedies and unnerving occurrences, the film's curse would heartbreakingly claim its youngest victim in 1988, when Heather O'Rourke, the actress portraying the pivotal role of Carol Ann, would pass away on February 1st. Many would be shocked by her passing, and several others would start putting the pieces together that something odd was happening to this franchise. Was there a death cloud hanging over the set? Could so many deaths really be considered merely tragic accidents? At what point does coincidence become curse? Tonight, we will reflect on the life of the bubbly young starlet and the massive talent she shared with the world in her short 12 years on this earth. Join me once again as we explore the Curse of Poltergeist. In the early spring of 1975, Kathleen O'Rourke's doctor delivered the wonderful news that she and her husband Michael had waited several weeks to hear. They were going to have their second child. Overjoyed with the news, they made the announcement to family and friends and began anxiously planning the arrival of this new baby. However, in the weeks that would follow, Kathleen began to feel that something was wrong. The young seamstress had already experienced one normal pregnancy and could not shake the feeling that there might be a problem. She would schedule an appointment with her doctor and would voice her concerns. Initially, the doctor would try to comfort Kathleen and Michael, but their worst fears were realized one evening when, suddenly feeling ill, Kathleen was rushed to the hospital. After an examination, the emergency room doctor would have to deliver the heartbreaking news. She had suffered a miscarriage. It was a terrible shock to the family that had been so excited to welcome this new baby, especially their first child, Tammy, who was confused as to why she was no longer going to have a baby brother or sister. The O'Rourke's family and closest friends would console and support the couple as they grieved, attempting to move on and recover from this devastating loss. The O'Rourke's resolved that they had to attempt to go on with their lives. During the month that would follow, Kathleen was beginning to heal somewhat emotionally. However, she was surprised to discover that she was still experiencing physical symptoms consistent with pregnancy. Kathleen would again plan a visit to her primary care physician, and the physician would once again attempt to allay her instincts and fears, assuring her that these feelings would pass and that they were quite normal. The physician would provide an alternative as a precaution, offering a procedure she could undergo to remedy whatever these symptoms were. However, Kathleen's maternal instincts would tell her otherwise, and she would refuse the procedure. Several more weeks would go by, and Kathleen would again return to the doctor, though why she didn't find a new doctor is beyond me. On this visit, she would insist that she was still carrying a child and asked for another examination to be sure. The results would be shocking, but still carried a weight of sadness with them. Kathleen had in fact lost a child in the womb. However, she had been pregnant with twins, and this other baby was still very much alive. And while the O'Rourkes would feel understandable sadness over the loss of the one baby, the fact that a new O'Rourke life was still on the way was nothing short of a miracle. That miracle would be realized just 2 days after Christmas, when on December 27th, 1975, Heather Michelle O'Rourke would be born in San Diego, California. 4 days later, the O'Rourke family and friends gathered to celebrate the bicentennial 1976 New Year's and to further celebrate the homecoming of their Christmas miracle baby, Heather. And while this would be cause for celebration for anyone, The O'Rourkes would have no way of knowing that their new baby, who almost never was, would be destined for so much more than just an ordinary life. She would instead eventually charm her way into the hearts and minds of people throughout the world, leaving an indelible memory on an entire generation, and beyond, for many horror movie fans. The facts of the talents of both the O'Rourke daughters would not take long to come to light. Shortly before Heather made her miraculous appearance, Kathleen had made the decision that she wanted to take on a small part-time job, working just a few short hours a day. In order to do this, she would have to find someone to watch Tammy, who at this time was only 3 years old. Tammy was too young for, and frankly not interested in, preschool, and for this lower middle-class family, daycare would be too exorbitant an expense. However, Kathleen found the perfect solution. She enrolled Tammy in dance class. Tammy would thrive in her classes and would quickly begin performing in recitals with her class. Tammy would continue with her classes and performances even after the birth of her little sister, and it wasn't long before the dance instructor would take Kathleen aside one day and encourage her to consider Tammy's dancing as more than just a simple hobby, but a serious talent that could be developed and potentially become professional. Tammy responded enthusiastically, and Kathleen would be supportive, entering Tammy into several local talent shows, to which Tammy would often come home receiving top honors. And with Heather, who was totally enamored with her big sister, and often in the habit of imitating everything that Tammy did, it was only natural to assume that she too would want to follow in Tammy's footsteps. And Heather would soon begin showcasing her own talents of singing and dancing on stage. When Heather was 3 years old, she even won a local Little Miss pageant. The two sisters would soon put their talents together and collaborate, doing a dance routine set to Heather singing, with Tammy dancing. Their parents were obviously proud of the pair, as they were even gaining a little local notoriety. But to Heather and Tammy, it was just two sisters having fun, and having fun together. On the heels of the encouragement Tammy had received from her dance instructor, she decided that she wanted to move beyond the local talent scene and focus on more serious dancing roles in larger productions. But this meant having to look outside of San Diego. So, with Heather in tow, Kathleen and Tammy began making frequent trips to Los Angeles. Here, Tammy would participate in several auditions and tryouts. They also obtained an agent to represent Tammy, and this, paired with her perseverance, would prove successful, and she would land several acting gigs in television commercials. But Tammy's main passion and focus would remain on dancing. As such, Tammy's agent would secure a role as a featured dancer in MGM's big-screen musical production of Pennies from Heaven. Soon after production began on Pennies from Heaven, in the summer of 1980, Heather's official Hollywood discovery would occur. Since Heather was still too young for school, she always accompanied her mother to Tammy's rehearsals and filming, and it did not take long for Kathleen to notice that Heather, too, seemed interested in acting. Tammy's agent seemed to take notice of this as well, and would extend an offer of representation for Heather as well. It would not take long for the photogenic young Heather, then a mere 4 years old, to start getting some exposure. She appeared in ads and on packaging for Mattel toys, including one for the iconic Barbie doll. And with an agent who was best known for representing actors, Heather would begin auditioning for more acting roles and would land jobs in restaurant commercials for both McDonald's and Long John Silver's. By the age of 5, Heather would make her first television appearance on the ABC drama Fantasy Island. Despite her impressive resume for such a young child, Heather would remain largely undiscovered until she would have a chance encounter with a little director by the name of Steven Spielberg. At the time, Spielberg had just wrapped filming on Raiders of the Lost Ark and was in preparations to begin filming E.T., but there was also another film project he had in the works, a film that was missing an actress for one of the plot's key roles. As the project began to take shape, Spielberg was panicking. Time was running out. E.T. alum Drew Barrymore had auditioned for the role, but Spielberg felt she wasn't quite right for the role he had in mind, and so he kept looking. During this time, Tammy was still working on the production of Pennies from Heaven. When filming would break for lunch at noon each day, Tammy would join Heather and Kathleen for lunch in the legendary MGM Studios commissary, which was regularly frequented by several of the most well-known and respected directors, actors, and stage personnel of the time. Due to the popularity of the commissary, it could be hard to obtain a seat, so it became Heather's job to save seats for the O'Rourke trio while Tammy and Kathleen grabbed their lunches. On one fateful lunch date, Heather was sitting, waiting, as usual, for her mother and sister to return. She had grown used to the crowded and cramped nature of her surroundings, so she was not concerned when a bearded man would approach her, introduce himself as Steve, and ask if he could talk with her, asking her name in return. Heather's reply would both impress and surprise Spielberg with her frankness, and in actuality the best reply the child could have offered. "I'm not allowed to talk to strangers," and would also let Steve know that her mother and sister would soon be returning. Spielberg would be intrigued and amused by the precocious young girl, and would ask if he could just wait with her until her mother came back. He also said that he respected her wish to not talk, and that he would just sit beside her quietly and wait. To this Heather would agree, and would be true to her word, and not speak a single word to Mr. Spielberg. When Tammy and Kathleen returned, they were a little surprised to see a man sitting with Heather, and they also didn't immediately recognize the man. Soon after, he introduced himself as Steven Spielberg, and as the realization settled in, they became flustered, recognizing that this conversation might lead to something life-changing. Heather, however, was less intrigued and not at all interested in her lunch companion. Spielberg would explain that he was casting for a movie and was curious about Heather's experience in film. When Kathleen would reply and tell Spielberg that Heather was 4 years old, Spielberg would then inform her that he was looking for someone a little older and would politely thank them for their time, offering a goodbye to a still disinterested Heather before going about his business. However, when lunchtime rolled back around the next day, Spielberg was back at the O'Rourke's chosen table, seemingly wanting to just learn a little bit more about this young girl, not able to shake the feeling that this just might be the girl he was looking for after all. He left his card, and they arranged for an interview and a scream test. During the interview, Spielberg informed Heather that the role he was casting for was for a scary movie, and that she would have to pretend to be scared and scream a lot, even though it would not be real, and there was not really anything there that would hurt her or scare her. Heather seemed to believe that this was something that she could do, so Spielberg began the audition by reading lines with Heather, and then moved on to the screaming demonstration. Heather would appropriately reply to the request that she provide a loud and piercing scream. Spielberg would then ask Heather for slight variations, providing directions, and ask for several more scream styles, to which Heather would appropriately comply every time. For an hour, before she would politely turn to Spielberg and say that she was done screaming for the day and would like to go home. And with that, Spielberg knew he had found his leading lady, a 4-year-old who could take direction, read a script, and pay attention for long periods of time. Spielberg felt that he had truly discovered something special, pure gold, in little Heather O'Rourke. He would call Kathleen the next day and offer the role to Heather, and she would immediately consent. And with that, Heather got the role of Carol Ann Freeling in that little scary movie by the name of Poltergeist. In the spring of 1981, when filming on Poltergeist began, Heather, who had turned 5 just a few months prior, had added a few commercials and that guest starring role on Fantasy Island to her acting credits. However, she had yet to be a part of anything that had the potential to scare her, and she was having some difficulty handling some of the more frightening sequences that involved the special effects. One scene in particular was a struggle, because not only was it physically demanding, but terrifying. And unfortunately, due to the way it needed to be shot, eliminated the use of a stunt double as a believable option. The scene in question was the pivotal scene in which Carol Ann is sucked into the closet, taken captive by the spirits of the house. The scene required the use of a movable room, which would allow the crew to tilt the entire room and camera, and with the aid of fans, make things in the room look as though they are being sucked into the closet, giving realism to the spectral vacuum that was attempting to literally suck everything into its grasp, including the taking captive of the young girl. This practical effect was actually made possible by the items actually sliding quite naturally due to gravity towards the end of the room. With the room tilted on its side, the objects would be literally falling into the closet, including Heather herself, who would appear to be clinging desperately to the headboard of her bed, being pulled by what appeared to be the spectral captors wanting her so badly. Heather was to be vertically suspended by a cable on the ceiling, about 30 feet above the floor, and while Spielberg had painstakingly crafted the effect himself, he quickly saw how challenging this was for Heather, and how demanding and physically taxing it was on her. Never mind how scary it must have been. Spielberg, who has a well-deserved reputation for being very kind and understanding of his younger stars, would pull Heather aside, comfort her, and promise to her that she never had to do the scene again, opting, for her sake, to forfeit a slight bit of believability in the scene and use a child stunt double in an obvious and terrible wig. However, aside from this scene, Heather was really enjoying her time, both on and off the set. She quickly earned the respect and admiration of the cast and crew, who were instantly impressed with her talent and professionalism for such a young age. Her fellow actors also grew quite fond of her and developed a high sense of love and adoration for her. And when filming wrapped, Spielberg, possibly drawn by guilt, would grant one last gift to Heather, allowing her to take home the 2 goldfish that had been the family's pets purchased to replace the kid's bird Tweety. May he rest in peace. In June of 1982, Poltergeist would be released in theaters, and movie audiences clamored to see the horror classic. And with that nearly overnight, Heather had exposure and acclaim for her abilities. However, her newfound success would not come without a price. In the early days of the young O'Rourke girls chasing their dreams, their father had been very tolerant and even supportive, as it had not at that point had any major impact on their daily lives as a family. However, with Tammy cast in Annie and Heather working on Poltergeist, the demands of fame began to disrupt the ideal family life, and even though he was proud of his little girls, would proclaim that he did not want to share his girls so much with the public. Understandably so. However, sadly, the final outcome of this would be that the parents would separate and eventually divorce, with Kathleen taking the girls and permanently relocating to Anaheim, quite literally right next to Disneyland. After the success of Poltergeist, Heather would begin to regularly appear in numerous television projects, including a recurring role on Happy Days in 1982. Heather would continue to audition and receive roles on TV over the course of the following 5 years, guest starring on some of the most well-known shows of the era, including Chips, Webster, Our House, and Leave It to Beaver. While Heather would continue to be busy with TV roles, Tammy would eventually retire from acting for good in 1983 when she was 12. The girls, in spite of it all, lived quite normal day-to-day lives, and Heather would even be given the honor of being named president of her 5th grade class at Big Bear Elementary. She would take lessons in flute and was an avid reader, considered quite smart for her young age. Banking on the success of Poltergeist MGM immediately called for a sequel, but producers would not sign off on another film. However, MGM was tenacious and persistent in their request for a continuation of the chronicles of the Freeling family, eventually offering the writing and production of Poltergeist II to Steven Spielberg's co-writers from the first film, who would immediately get started on the task of writing the screenplay, which would be completed not even a year later. In anticipation, MGM would announce their plans to begin filming in 1984. They immediately set to work securing the cast to reprise their roles, and due to the success of the first film, was able to offer higher compensation, securing all of the original stars, minus Dominique Dunne, who had already passed. If you have not watched our video on Dominique Dunne, which was part 2 of our series, I will link it in the description below. I do have to warn you, though, the details are graphic and may be hard to watch. Production would begin on Poltergeist II in the summer of 1985, and Heather was extremely excited to be working with her on-screen family again. However, filming the sequel would prove to be an arduous task as the production was plagued with delays and other strange occurrences. One could say that when filming a horror movie, it might come with a territory that you might be inviting some unwanted and unwelcome guests. Several crew members were getting injured in bizarre and freak accidents beyond what would be considered normal. As a response to these odd occurrences, and with genuine concern for the cast and crew, Will Sampson, who we covered in part 3 of this series, would use his skills as a real-life shaman to conduct an on-set exorcism. But for the cast, including young Heather, the show had to go on. Filming would eventually be completed, behind schedule, in late 1985, leading to a rushed post-production, with the film making its premiere in May of 1986. Even though the sequel did not obtain the same level of success as the original, it still did reasonably well, managing to pull in $75 million at the box office on a $19 million budget. Heather's career also gained additional momentum. With her growing success came a growing salary as well, and her family would buy a larger home in Big Bear, and Heather would continue to balance her career with being a normal child. By the end of 1986, MGM would announce their intentions for a third installment in the Poltergeist series. In a strange, yet consistent coincidence, the studio was unable to entice the team of writer, director, and producer of Poltergeist II to do another sequel, and, yet again, found themselves scrambling to find suitable replacements to helm this third film in the franchise. They would find their writer in Gary Sherman, who would also take on the role of director, as he had already started making a name for himself directing a series of low-budget shocker films. Sherman would also bring with him his own creative style, and he would put his own spin on the third film, taking it from a setting that he called homely, rustic, and suburban, replacing it with what to him was more sleek, modern, and metropolitan. His vision would lead him to the John Hancock Center, a skyscraper in his hometown of Chicago, Illinois, as the setting for his version of the ghost story. Obviously, the first actor that MGM would approach for Poltergeist III would be Little Miss Heathero'rourke, because they knew well enough that she was the bread and butter for the potential success of this third film, and it would require her participation. Initially excited to be once again reprising her role as Carol Ann Freeling, Heather was quickly disappointed when she learned that due to the tight budget of the third film, the only previous actor returning was Zelda Rubinstein, reprising her role as Tangina Barons. In addition to not working with any of the other familiar Poltergeist faces, with this film being shot in Chicago, it would also take her away from her home for many months. But with Heather's bubbly and friendly personality, she would make new friends on set easily and would become very dear to the older cast and crew, especially director Gary Sherman.
And now a word from our sponsors.
VENATOS is in our hands. It's left to us, guys. And we gotta do something with it.
Anyone who's been a part of the Press Start family for any amount of time knows that I truly appreciate and value the relationship that I have with today's sponsor, VENATOS. They are truly an outstanding company with great quality products that I can truly get behind and put my stamp of approval on. Their customer service is absolutely hands down some of the best on the marketplace. If you reach out to them for any reason, your emails are typically responded to within hours, not days. Hours. And not only do they promise to make it right, they promise to make it better. And as a thank you for your support, they are offering a 10% discount on any orders if you use the code PRESSSTARTMOM at checkout. They do ship internationally, including Canada, and 100% stand by the quality of their products. And so do I. Thank you, VENATOS, for sponsoring this video, and thank you to all of you for checking out VENATOS. Let's get back to the video. Shortly before pre-production began on Poltergeist III, Heather began showing signs and symptoms of a kind of illness that her mother could not figure out what it was. Heather had been ill for some time with what Kathleen believed to be the flu. The local pediatrician that Heather saw in Big Bear would point out the fact that it was the winter season, and they lived in a mountainous region during cold and flu season. So the doctor saw no cause for alarm, but Heather's symptoms lingered, and as the pre-production for Poltergeist III was drawing closer, Heather's mother and her agent were worried that she was still ill. Kathleen's fears would only increase when Heather would return home from school one afternoon with swelling in her lower legs and feet. Kathleen knew this was not something to be taken lightly, and would drive her youngest daughter all the way to San Diego, which was a 145-mile drive, and would take approximately 3.5 hours one way. These strange symptoms would also be attributed to the flu. The doctor would prescribe medication standard for combating the flu, and Heather was sent home. Her mother was informed to monitor her condition and bring her back if she did not improve, which would prove to be the case, and Kathleen and Heather would again return to San Diego. And on this visit, doctors thought it possible that Heather was having some sort of a reaction to some form of a spider bite, prescribing an antibiotic and again sending the mother and daughter on their way. In a series of events very reminiscent of the birth of Heather, this second trip home would prove to be short-lived again and was not the solution. And Kathleen would take Heather to San Diego for a third time. This time, having twice not been able to provide an answer, the doctors decided it might be best to admit Heather and to run a series of tests. And these laboratory results would finally reveal the truth. Heather's intestinal tract had been infected with a microorganism called Giardia, which, based on the fact that they had made 3 trips before this diagnosis was revealed, you'd think it would be a rare condition. However, that's not the case. This was a common diagnosis in mountainous areas like Big Bear, and was usually contracted by drinking water from an untreated water source. While the diagnosis itself was considered fairly common for the area, the part that was baffling to doctors was the fact that no other members of the O'Rourke clan got the parasite. With the fact that they all lived in the same house and would therefore most likely be drinking the same water, it was odd that no one else came down with these symptoms. With doctors not being able to determine the exact source of the infection, they would prescribe Flagyl for Heather, and finally, she would begin to show signs of improving. Ever the concerned mother, Kathleen would request several follow-up examinations before she would allow Heather to travel to Chicago for filming on Poltergeist III. These examinations would consist of x-rays and other imaging studies of Heather's stomach and intestines. Although these would reveal that the Giardia infection was no longer present, the inflammation in Heather's small intestine remained, and doctors suspected she might be in the early stages of Crohn's disease, an inflammatory bowel disease that is known to sometimes occur following an infection involving the gastrointestinal tract. Heather was prescribed a medication for Crohn's disease to minimize further inflammation and damage to her intestines. Heather was given the green light and would travel to Chicago to begin filming on Poltergeist III. Kathleen would insist upon a doctor being assigned to Heather during all of filming, which was granted. Heather would continue taking the prescribed medication during the filming, and its side effects would notably alter her appearance as the production progressed. But the treatment she was receiving from her doctor appeared to be working, and her symptoms gradually reduced. And by the end of principal filming in June of 1987, Heather's appearance began to return to normal. Filming wrapped, Heather and her family planned a celebratory vacation to Disney World. Heather started 7th grade. Everything seemed to be returning to normal. But when dealing with cursed films, normal is always short-lived. At the end of January in 1988, Heather started feeling sick again. On January 29th, which was a Friday, Heather would casually mention to her sister that she did not feel like attending class that day, although she never fully said why, which was very much unlike Heather because even if she were feeling sick, she seldom, if ever, complained about it, and she did eventually go to class. That Saturday, she stayed at home most of the day, but in the evening went out to eat at a restaurant that Tammy was working at, and seemed to be feeling all right. By the following day, though, it was apparent that Heather was really ill. Sunday morning, Heather's mother and stepfather were awakened to the sounds of her being sick in the bathroom. Her mother would call out to her, and Heather would crawl into their bed with them and rest for a few hours. She would spend the rest of the day sleeping on the couch, while her mother would periodically check on her. Heather's symptoms, much like they had in the beginning of her original diagnosis, started out flu-like, so her mother did the best she could to keep her comfortable, giving her fluids and letting her rest. Monday morning, February 1st, Heather awakened for school as usual and went into the kitchen to sit with her mother and have breakfast. Her mother would ask how she was feeling, and Heather would let out a not quite believable, okay. Kathleen was, of course, concerned. She gave her daughter a piece of toast, considering what the best options were. The question of whether or not Heather was seriously ill was answered some minutes later when Kathleen noticed that Heather was having difficulty eating and that she seemed lethargic. Slightly concerned, Kathleen questioned Heather again about how she was feeling. Heather's response was, "Mom, I can't swallow." At this point, it was clear that something was wrong. Kathleen became very concerned and took a closer look at her daughter. Heather's face was pale, and when her mother touched her hands, she noticed that they were cold and that her fingers had a bluish tint to them. She also could hear that Heather's breathing had become shallow and labored, and that she appeared to be trembling and growing weaker. Now thoroughly alarmed, Kathleen called the local hospital, which advised her to bring Heather in right away. She told Heather to get dressed, but shortly after getting up from the table, Heather cried out to her mother as she slumped to the floor, holding her stomach. Now on the verge of panic, Heather's mother held and comforted her daughter, while Heather's stepfather dialed 911. During the time that it took for the ambulance to get there, Heather remained on the floor, still conscious and coherent, but listless. When the paramedics arrived, they immediately began assessing her condition and treating her accordingly. They fitted Heather for a mask to administer oxygen, to which she would protest, insisting that she did not need it. The paramedics would ask her how she was feeling. Her response was that she was feeling a little sick, but assured them that she was all right. They gently placed her on a gurney and loaded her into the back of the ambulance. Her mother climbed into the back of the cab for the short trip to the local emergency room. Heather would be alert for most of the trip and was able to talk to her attending paramedics, but shortly before arriving at the hospital, she lapsed into unconsciousness. The paramedics immediately began attempting to revive her as the ambulance radioed ahead that cardiac arrest had occurred. They continued their efforts until they pulled up to the entrance of the emergency room, where a team of doctors and nurses who had been notified and were prepared for their arrival would meet them. The emergency room team immediately took over the resuscitation of Heather, and after several long minutes, succeeded in restoring her vital signs. After she was stabilized, Heather's mother would be informed of the critical nature of her condition and that she would have to be transported by life flight helicopter to another hospital. The initial examination had determined that Heather was in shock, but they also noticed that her stomach looked swollen and other signs of what strongly indicated a bowel obstruction. The staff further suspected that the obstruction might have already burst and started an infection. They made preparations to transport her to another facility that specialized in pediatric critical care. Heather was airlifted to Children's Hospital and Health Center in San Diego. She would arrive in stable yet critical condition and remained unconscious and unresponsive while they evaluated her and prepared for possible surgery. When her mother and stepfather arrived, they were informed of her condition and that she might have already suffered permanent brain damage due to the episode of cardiorespiratory arrest that occurred during the ambulance trip. With her mother's permission, doctors performed an exploratory procedure and promptly discovered that Heather indeed had an obstruction in her small intestine that had become infected and had already burst. When this occurred, the infectious contents spilled into Heather's abdomen, and bacteria had entered her bloodstream, where they rapidly multiplied and spread throughout her body. This overwhelming infection and buildup of bacterial toxins eventually caused septic shock, and the situation was now life-threatening and required immediate emergency surgery to remove the obstruction and to repair Heather's small intestine. The operation was a common procedure with a high rate of success and recovery and was routinely performed on pediatric patients at Children's Hospital, and Heather's mother immediately agreed to it. But because of the overwhelming bacterial infection, septic shock, and apparent brain damage she had suffered, Heather's condition was uncertain even before the surgery was attempted. And so her mother was also informed that Heather might not survive. The operation was completed, and the intensive care resumed, but Heather showed no signs of improvement. She never regained consciousness, and as was feared, her brain showed no activity. She remained alive, but shortly after 2 p.m., her condition began to worsen, and soon after, her heartbeat faltered, and her breathing stopped. For more than a half an hour, doctors tried desperately to resuscitate her, but finally, all hope was lost, and they had to give up their efforts, and Heather died at 2:43 p.m. at 12 years old. Her official cause of death would be ruled as congenital stenosis of the intestine, complicated by septic shock. Daniel Hollander, the head of gastroenterology at the University of California, Irvine Medical Center, stated that O'Rourke's death was distinctly unusual, and she lacked prior symptoms of the bowel defect. However, Dr. Hollander further stated that it was possible for congenital bowel narrowing to cause sudden death without symptoms if an infection caused the bowel to rupture. Family and celebrity friends, including Henry Winkler, Linda Pearl, and Ricky Schroeder, would gather in a chapel the Friday following her death for a simple funeral. To all who knew her, she was genuine. In a world of plastics, she was real, the Reverend Dennis Estelle told the 120 mourners during a 20-minute service in the Westwood Memorial Park Chapel. The Reverend, who was a family friend, said Heather wanted 2 things in her life. She wanted an Academy Award. She wanted a Rolls Royce, the minister said, adding that now she's wearing a crown to wear through eternity. We've all been blessed to share in the love of Heather. Heather's open pink and gray metal casket was set amid several floral arrangements. After the funeral, the casket was carried 100 yards to a sun-splashed mausoleum wall and sealed in a ground-level crypt near that of actor Peter Lawford. 30 yards away is the grave of one-time child star Natalie Wood, and another 100 feet away is the crypt of Marilyn Monroe. So even in death, she's surrounded by what she loves. And if anything were clear from the short life of Heather O'Rourke, it was that she loved acting. She loved the roles that she played, She loved the cast and crew that surrounded her, and they loved her right back. In sitting down to think of a conclusion to this video, doing so today of all days is kind of ironic, and I apologize if you can hear it in the background. But the rain is coming down, and the thunder is roaring, which seems like a good setting for the sadness of losing someone so young. Death at any age is tragic. But when it's just a child, a 12-year-old little girl, and something that truly feels like could have been prevented, so many medical missteps along the way. The hardest part about not just the Cursed Films playlist, but the 27 Club playlist. There are so many stars that shone so bright that we will never know just how far they could have gone. Dominique Dunne was prepped to be an amazing starlet, as was Heather. Julian Beck had a long-standing career in theater. Will Sampson just had a natural ability to draw people to him. But what else could they have done? Well, we'll never know. The best part about covering the Cursed Films and the 27 Club is that they're not really gone. I watched Poltergeist last night, and it still is impactful. It still is scary, and the performances are just as visceral now as they were when I was first old enough to be allowed to watch them, which was probably still too young. The purpose of the Cursed Films playlist and the 27 Club playlist, yes, is to talk about some of the eerier, scarier, sadder things of life. But more so, I hope what they've given you is what they've given me. A greater appreciation for its stars and the indelible marks that they've left on history. The films, the music, the artwork that we can still turn to today and appreciate. Their lives may have felt cursed, but in what we have left of them, I think we should all feel pretty blessed. Thank you for joining me again as we continue to explore the curse surrounding the Poltergeist franchise. I'm grateful to all of you who found me recently, and I hope that you'll consider subscribing and liking the video and sticking around for a few more, and maybe telling your friends. Once again, I have to extend a great thank you to VENATOS for their continued support of the channel. They are absolutely one of the most supportive and kind groups of people that I've ever had the pleasure of working with, and I look forward to a continued relationship with them going forward. And of course, I have to extend an absolutely heartfelt thank you to all of my top subscribers. You guys keep coming back for more, leaving comments, liking the videos, and making me feel empowered to continue making films. And when you're small like I am, that means more than I think you guys realize. It's a long road on YouTube, but it's a road I'm enjoying, and I'm glad you're all on the road with me. Until next time, take care of yourselves, love those around you, and appreciate each day. See you next time.
At the age of 12, Heathero'rourke had been a Hollywood star for most of her life. She appeared in all 3 Poltergeist movies and on television as well. She was also president of her elementary school class outside of Los Angeles. But Sunday, she became ill with the flu. Yesterday, she got worse, and on the way to the hospital, she died at the age of 12.
We're talking about near-death experiences. Actor Richard Lawson was telling us about his experience earlier this March when the plane ended up upside down in the bay, and you left us with, you realized that you were up out of the water and that you were now breathing, you could breathe air.
Right.
And then came the 2009 murder of Lou Perryman. He had been active in the film industry from as early as 1977 all the way up until his final film role in 2003. But on April 1st of 2009, Lou Perryman was murdered in his home by recently released criminal Seth Tatum.